Namaste, dear friends, and a very warm welcome back to this course on Introduction to Indian Psychology. I sincerely hope that so far you have been able to find some new insights in the way that Indian psychology approaches human nature and its relationship with the world. In our previous week, we looked at the concepts of self and identity, the spectrum of consciousness and planes and parts of the being. We mapped it based on Sri Aurobindo's understanding of the same. After that, we looked at the Mandukya Upanishads, the states of consciousness, followed by the types of knowledge that we can have. And then we looked at the Vedic framework of Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, along with Dharma. This was accompanied by the notions of Prakriti, Swabhava, and the Swadharma. So this was all about understanding the individual. But one thing that had emerged in the course of our discussions last time was the idea that all of this is not taking place in a void. It's not random. There seems to be a certain purpose in the entire story. And since many of us belong to the Indian civilization, we know that one of the words that is often used to describe this game is Leela. So life is a Leela. All of creation is a Leela. It's a game. If it is a game, it means that then there are certain objectives, there are certain goals of the game, there are certain rules of the game. So what are those goals becomes important to understand in order to play the game well. So this week we are going to try and focus on understanding the context in which human life becomes meaningful and why whatever action we undertake needs to have a proper direction in the way that it is moving. So today's lecture is going to be on the Purusharthas and the Chaturashrama. The lecture overview, we're going to first look at the mapping of the human journey with the framework of the Purusharthas, which are about the goals of life. We'll introduce you to the concept, and then we look at certain foundational systematizers like Maharshi Vyasa, Maharshi Kapila. We'll also understand the historical trajectory from the Vedic press to the Upanishadic quest for moksha. What was the ultimate destination that we were being asked to pursue? And then we look at a conceptual deep dive where we'll examine the granular analysis of dharma, artha, kama and moksha, which in fact are the four purusharthas. We'll understand the systemic interaction by exploring the regulatory checks and balances that exist between the four goals and that have been talked about by the various leaders of society, by the various people who've written the different dharma shastras. We'll engage in a comparison with Western psychology and look at the contrasting Indian motivational models with modern motivation constructs. Then we look at the rebirth factor, how Punarjanma or rebirth extends the motivational horizon. Sri Aurobindo has a unique integral view to the entire thing, which we will try and understand. Then we will map the Purusharthas with the next important framework of the Chaturashramas. And the Chaturashrama is about the different stages of life. We'll do a deep dive and get some detailed analysis about it. We'll try and understand the contemporary relevance of these frameworks. Look at a summary followed by exercise, glossary and references and food for thought that by now you must have got accustomed to. And I sincerely hope that you're taking the trouble to allow these exercises that we propose or the food for thought that we're proposing to play in your consciousness so that this subject is not just something that you study and you forget it, you've done an exam, but it is meant to transform. The very engagement with the subject is meant to transform your being. Only then you will be actually scoring the right grades for the subject. So what is Purushartha? It is an integrated definition of human purpose. So in terms of etymology, it's formed of two words, Purusha meaning conscious being and Artha meaning purpose, goal, value, etc. So Purushartha is what are those conscious goals and values that we are following as conscious beings. Then it has a holistic scope because it acknowledges the biological aspect of the individual's social, economic and transpersonal needs. We'll understand this as we uncover what the four Purusharthas are all about. It talks about the two spheres. So it balances Abhyudaya, which is about worldly welfare, with Nishreyasa or the spiritual good. So there is a relationship between the greater good of the collective and the intrinsic good of the individual. So how do they merge and offer the best experience to individuals? In terms of psychological realism, this concept of Purushartha does not deny the basic human tendencies. So it accepts desires and ambitions as valid human drivers. In terms of the teleological nature, human identity is defined by the values it pursues. So who are these foundational systematizers? The first one that we come across is Maharshi Vyasa. Just want to tell you that the word Vyasa basically means a compiler. So there are several Vyasas, and because we are not so sure whether it's the same one, whether there are many, we are not able to come to any conclusion about all of this, but there are different attributions by the tradition itself. So he is said to be the compiler of the Vedas and many other foundational texts. A quick overview of his life. So Vyasa itself means a compiler or a classifier, and like I mentioned, there are several of them, anything ranging between 18 to 24 Vyasas are heard about in our literature. So Veda Vyasa was the classifier of the Vedas, that's why it's Veda Vyasa. He's also known as Badarayana because he lived in Badarikashrama and did penance there. He's the author of the Brahma Sutras because he systematized the Vedanta and he defined the ultimate human drive as Brahma Jijnasa, or the quest to understand the Brahman consciousness. He's also known as Krishna Dvaipayana because of his dark complexion, Krishna, and his birth on an island, which is a Dvipa, so Dvaipayana, in the river Yamuna. He's also the author of the Mahabharata, as we all know. He's also the progenitor of the Pandavas and Kauravas. He codified the Chaturvargas, the 4 goals in the Mahabharata, and he showed us through characters like Yudhishthira how these values clash and resolve in real life. He's the author of 18 major Puranas as well. The other person is Maharshi Kapila Muni, and we've already seen him earlier on. He's the father of the Sankhya Darshana. We've already looked at his birth story, but basically he's the son of Kardama, Prajapati and Devahuti, and he's born in a hermitage on the Saraswati river banks. In terms of the foundation of Sankhya, he's said to be the originator of that, and he wrote the text called the Sankhya Sutras. There's this important legend connected to him where he burnt the 60,000 sons of King Sagara because they accused him of stealing a horse. And then Bhagiratha had to bring down the river Ganga to revive all his brethren. What is his legacy? He is revered as one of the greatest sages whose philosophy has influenced the Bhagavad Gita and several other thought systems. Important contributions. His first systematic framework was made in order to propose that consciousness and matter are 2 different things, so the duality of consciousness and matter. And he developed the doctrine of 2 eternal independent realities, namely Purusha and Prakriti. He also founded the rationale for understanding human suffering and the path to liberation, which is moksha or kaivalya. When Purusha is no longer attached to Prakriti and her drama, he steps back in himself, that's kaivalya, and that's when the drama ceases according to this school of philosophy or darshana. What's the next one? We see that the origin and evolution of the Purushartha has its roots in the Vedic period. So there is a primary focus of the Trivarga there. This is a very, very interesting phenomena because we normally tend to think of the Vedas as being esoteric texts. But we see that in the Vedas, they're actually talking of the Trivarga. We'll see those 3, which are Dharma, Artha and Kama. So we needed to live life to the fullest. It wasn't about an afterlife that we were talking about. But it also includes the concept of seeking for Amritatva. So what are the three Vargas? We have Dharma, which is righteous duty, the foundational pillar ensuring all actions conform to cosmic order or Rita and the law that it refers to. Then we have Artha, which is prosperity or wealth, and this is the pursuit of material well-being, resources and economic success through righteous means. Next is Kama, pleasure or desire, the fulfillment of psychological, sensual and emotional desires, including love and enjoyment. But both of these have to be regulated by Dharma. And it should act as a tripod supporting each other. If one is missed or overemphasized, it says that life will become unstable. So I think what was very, very special about this approach here is the acceptance of human nature as such in the midst of life. And how do we lead our actions in a manner to help us fulfill the greatest well-being for us within that game of life. So we find the concept of Amritatva in the Veda. And this is a mantra that all of you are very familiar with, I'm sure, known as the Mahamrityunjaya mantra, the great death-conquering mantra. So I'll just say it and you can say it along with me. So, Om Triambakai Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshiyamamritaat. So what is it saying? Om, we worship the three-eyed one, Triambakam, who is fragrant, Sugandhim, increasing the nourishment of our spiritual core, Pushti Vardhanam. From these many bondages, worldly ties, similar to the cucumbers tied to their creepers. So, Urva Rukamiva Bandhanat. Mukshya is the common verb there. Mrityoho Mukshya. So, may I be liberated from death or attachment to perishable things. And I am not from the immortality. So, here it says, so that I am not separated from the perception of immortality or the immortal essence that is pervading in everything. These are very, very powerful mantras. I mean, beyond the fact of the meaning that we've understood, just chanting them can cause literal miracles in one's own life and in the lives of people close to us. The next is the Upanishadic concept of Amritatva or immortality, moksha again. So, the Upanishads shift from the Trivarga concept of the Vedas to the idea of moksha being at the heart of the human endeavor. So, we have this mantra from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad which says, Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So, what does it say? Asataha and Sat. Okay, these are the two words in the first line. So, Asat means untruth or falsehood or non-being. So, lead me from the non-being to the being. So, Gamaya means make me go. Make me go from the non-being to the being. Lead me from the darkness to light. Lead me from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. So normally this is the meaning that we are all very familiar with. And what it tells us is that these are two separate states and we have to go from one to the other. But there's another interpretation that a teacher from the ashram school had told me, Matri Bhai. So what he had said is that you have the word asataha. In Sanskrit, asataha can either mean from or it can mean of. In which case you get the second meaning that I have given there, which I think is even more powerful and insightful, which says, lead me to the being of the non-being. So lead me to the truth of the falsehood. Lead me to the light of the darkness. Lead me to the immortality of death. Om, peace, peace, peace. If you look at this second translation, we see that all of these negatives are like veils. It's not that we have to let that go and go to another place of a positive realization, but within the darkness, there is the light. So how do we move all the darknesses and touch the light beyond it? And because it's not something that we can necessarily do by ourselves, there is this call for surrender and to be allowed to be taken to that higher destination by the forces that are conscious of what lies beyond the apparent veils of things. So here we have the four Purusharthas, which are Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Dharma is what does the world need from me? Moksha is from the question, who am I? Kama is what do I love doing? And Artha is what do I need to sustain my life? So answering several very fundamental questions of life. But I wanted to also try here to show you the transliteration part of it, which is what you see with the dots and all. So you see when we're writing Moksha, in transliteration, we would put a dot below it. That would make it moksha because we put 26 letters in the English alphabet and 49 in the Sanskrit. So how do we do a mapping of the sounds? We do so by adding these dots and lines on top of them. So artha is fine and kama. You see, when you look at this in English, there can be a lot of errors. You can say kama, kama or kama. You have a variety of pronunciations. So here, the moment you put a long line on top there, it becomes a kama. Okay, so Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha. So, what is Dharma? It's the regulator. The core meaning of Dharma is that it is the thing that upholds because it comes from the root dhr, meaning to uphold, to support or to maintain. We talk about the cosmic order where we understand that there are natural laws that govern this universe and therefore it is what is important to maintain the order of the universe in the individual life and in the system outside of it. It summarizes the Vedic triad as we have already seen in the previous week that if you understand Dharma, it implies the knowledge of the Satyam, Ritam and Brihat, and I've given you the example of the glove where if you want to wear the right glove to do the right action, you have to know the contours of your hand, Satya. wear the right glove. So the vision has to be ideal with Satya, the execution has to be ideal with the Rita or the right. The action will automatically be of a Brihat or a vast nature. So here we talk of Satyam Eva Jayate Nanritam, and I had mentioned in brief that Satyam Eva Jayate, which is the motto of the nation, is saying that truth is a winner. So that is how we normally tend to interpret it, that, my truth, your truth, that's how we tend to argue about it. But this is a very important distinction here, because we are talking of Jayate, not Jayati. If it was Jayati, then truth makes you win, makes me win, etc. But here it says Jayate, which in Sanskrit is a kind of a conjugation known as Atma Nepadi, which means that truth is a self-winner. It is itself a winner. So if you practice the ideas, there will already be a natural victory for that individual or that entity. Na anritam, nanritam, not the not right. Only if you are visualizing it correctly and enacting it in execution rightly will you be a winner. Otherwise, it cannot happen. And that, I think, is a problem with most of us. Many of us know what is right, but we're unable to follow it. We know what is not right and we're unable to abstain. So this was a typical Duryodhan syndrome, where he says, Janami dharmam natame pravritti. I know what is the right thing, but I'm unable to do it. Janami adharmam natame nivritti. I know what is not right, but I'm not being able to stop. Then he says that there is as if some force within me that is pushing me, and I feel like a helpless victim in this whole situation. So moving on, we see that there is this other verse from the Manusmriti which says, Dharma eva hato hanti, dharmo rakshati rakshitaha. This is a very important line, that dharmo rakshati rakshitaha. So if you are practicing dharma, you will automatically be protected. And it says that the second line is, Tasma dharmo na hantavyo, mano dharmo hato vadhit. The translation is that dharma destroys when destroyed. So if you're not doing dharma, then everything will get destroyed in the process. Dharma protects when protected. Therefore, dharma should never be destroyed or abandoned, lest the destroyed or the abandoned dharma destroys us. Alright, so a lot of primacy in this, and in very simple terms, it means that if there are rules, if there are, let's say, rules in a football game, you're playing contrary to the rules, you're bound to lose, or you might be dismissed. So if you want to win the game, you have to play as per the rules and play it in the best way possible in order to score the maximum goals and win the game. All right. So dharma is really about understanding these laws of life. In terms of its translatabilities, dharma is one of those very important words which is a Sanskrit non-translatable. So Rajiv Malhotra talks about this, where he says there are certain terms in our tradition, Sanskrit words and other terms, which you cannot really translate with single words in the English language, or maybe there is no identical translation at all because the worldviews are different. So here he says that there is no single English word that translates it identically. Even the words like ethics and morality don't really do justice to what dharma has to offer us. In terms of the social context, it goes beyond morality and ethics. In another context, we have the idea of rights versus dharma. So there are societies that are based on rights. It is my right to get this, my right to get that. In our context, we talk of it is our dharma to do something. So just to give you an insight on that, if one says that it is the child's right to get educated, this is a prevalent kind of an attitude when we are talking about giving people their due. In the Indic context, we always talked of the concept of dharma. So it is the dharma of the parents to ensure that the children are well taught. So if every individual just did their dharma, automatically those who had to receive their rights would be protected by the practice of dharma by those who are in those respective positions. And finally, it acts as the foundation of society. We can sort of equate the term dharma with duty, righteousness, etc. Now, what is the psychological context? From a psychoanalytical perspective, it acts as the moral superego that regulates biological and material instincts, but in a far more complex manner. So there are kind of similarities, but we have to be careful about considering them to be identical. Now, dharma and the Dharma Shastra. So this is a definition in the Mahabharata of the term dharma. It says, dharana dharmam ityahur dharmo dharayate prajaha yat syad dharana sanyuktam sadharma iti nishchayaha. So what's the translation? Dharma is so called because it sustains, it upholds all beings. Whatever is characterized by the capacity to sustain it is surely dharma. There are about 18 major smritis or dharma shastras that were written, and they're attributed to various authors according to Yajnavalkya. But again, what is important is that this part is giving us the literature that is available on the concepts of Purusharthas and many other aspects of society as it was in earlier times. So the important notion regarding the Smriti Shastras is that they were meant for a particular age. They had universal concepts, but they were also meant for a particular age. So we should be careful not to over apply them in our contemporary age and therefore start criticizing it without having a proper understanding of the context in which they were being first conceived of. So here we have the modern scholarship of Kane. He tells us that there in the history of Dharma Shastra, he has identified over 100 different texts that are known by the Middle Ages. So many of them are lost and only they are known through the citations in later commentaries. In terms of the survival of primary texts, there is a vast corpus, but we only know a few that are available easily. So Manusmriti is one of them, Yajnavalkya Smriti is another one, the Narada Smriti is a third one, and Vishnu Smriti is another one that is more commonly available. And the content is, as I mentioned, it is universal but age specific as well. So there is Desha Kala Patra understanding in the application of the laws that are given in the Smriti Shastras. So next, moving on to some definitions of dharma. There are lots of them here. So don't get panicky at all by looking at this. I just placed them there for those who are interested, because this is closely connected to what we will look at later on when we talk of the Daivi and Asuri Sampat. What are those qualities that are recommended that promote the experience of dharma? So just have a look at this and we will move ahead. That's just there for those who can't read the Devanagari as well. What are the different types of dharma and their significance? So we already are familiar with the idea of Swadharma, which is about discovering one's own Swabhava and looking at one's nature in order to understand which stage of life we are, the ashrama, and then act in that manner. What is the Sanatana Dharma? The Sanatana Dharma are these eternal laws. So our rishis and all very early on recognize that laws are operational. What are these laws that are universal? If you understand those laws, you function more effectively. So Sanatana Dharma is not a religion. It is about understanding the laws of the workings of the cosmos and then leading our lives on that basis. So it consists of the universal virtues like honesty, patience and ahimsa or non-violence and several others. From a yogic perspective, dharma is a path of righteousness that aligns an individual with their highest potential. In terms of motivation, it represents the shift towards intrinsic motivation, where action is performed because it is right, regardless of external reward. So dharma is the root of other purusharthas. So Sita tells this to Rama on entering the Dandakaranya, because this is a definition given by Valmiki in the Aranya Kanda. He says, Dharmad artha prabhavati, dharmat prabhavate sukham, dharmena labhate sarvam, dharmasaram idam jagat. What does it mean? So dharmad artha prabhavati, wealth and arth, which is artha, originates from righteousness or dharma. Dharmat prabhavate sukham, happiness or sukham originates from righteousness. Dharmena labhate sarvam, through righteousness everything is obtained. Dharmasaram idam jagat. Indeed, the essence of this world is righteousness. We've also saw in our last class, when we were looking at dharma specifically, that we had the different schools of thought like the Buddhism and Jainism, which also had this concept of dharma and the right actions that were at the heart of their approach or their pathways to moksha as well. Moving on to the next one, which is artha or material security. So here we see the definition is that it is the acquisition of wealth, power and the means required to fulfill one's life and duties. So it says utthanam arthasya moolam anarthasya viparyayaha utthane hi phalabhave bhavyartha papa karmasu. So I have given you a lot of verses, all right? But once again, I would like to assure you, you're not expected to remember all those verses. These verses are there as authoritative support to the ideas that Indian psychology is founded on. And the beauty is that the more you understand the literature, you will be able to appreciate the nuances in which these particular terms have been used and they apply in our lives. So what does this say? It says activity or effort and industry is the root of wealth. Now, Like I said, this is not like some philosophical thing. It's a very practical matter that if you're not putting in hard work, you're not going to get any kind of money. Inactivity and laziness is the root of the reverse of poverty or destruction. If there is no activity, if economic activity is not managed, the expected results are not achieved and the future prosperity is destroyed. So as you can see, there are very, very practical points in how do we manage our wealth and what's the best way in which you can increase it also. Then the Mahabharata says that artha dharma prabhavati. So one is that dharma is supposed to be a supporter of artha. So if you want to earn money, if you want to spend money, if you want to grow your wealth, then it has to be done on the principles of dharma, says our Shastra. And but in this case, we see that dharma also comes from artha. So if there is enough money, then you're not forced to steal, for example. One is not forced to, but then life is quite a strange place, and in the Kali Yuga more so. But normally, if there is enough, then one would normally not resort to the negative behavioral patterns. So the core components of artha, it represents material well-being, it encompasses wealth, property, financial security and economic success. There is a necessary for sustaining oneself and one's family. In terms of career and skills, it includes the acquisition of knowledge, professional skills and a career that enables an individual to make a living. In terms of security and stability, as you can see, it is beyond mere money. It refers to sources required to live with dignity, such as food, shelter, clothing and health. So, artha is not just the financial wealth as such, but it also includes the assets, it includes other things which we regard as our prosperity. And then we have societal responsibility for a government or a state. It involves good governance, social welfare and economic policy to ensure collective prosperity. Okay, that concept of abhyudaya was very, very important. And then we have the psychological necessity because it addresses safety and social standing needs. Next, in terms of the householder's duty, wealth is required to sustain the other three stages of life. And when we come to the Chaturashrama concept, we'll see the connection. In terms of the constraints, wealth is a means, it is not an end in the Indian context. So it must be used in order to serve dharma, not as an end in itself. For detachment, it is important to maintain the fact that we will have to be finally detached from the wealth that we are utilizing also, because the more we get caught up by that, it can lead us to various kinds of traps. So while dealing with wealth, little or much, we can keep our balance and retain a sense of a detachment if we want to make the most of the wealth that we have with us. So we see one example, Ratan Tata. He was such a wealthy person, one of the world's richest people. But then the kind of lifestyle he led, the way in which he dealt with everybody around him was very, very different and very humble. The next is kama, or desire and delight. So we see that these are the definitions from Vatsayana's Kama Sutra. So I said, let's look at some of the original definitions itself. And Kama Sutra is all about how do we engage in the fulfillment of our desires at various levels. So it says, Shrotra, Tvak, Chakshuhu, Jifva, Ghrananam, Atma Sanyuktena, Manasa, Adhishthithanam, Sveshu Sveshu Vishayeshu, Anukulyam Pravrittihi Kamaha. So what is Kama? So a simple translation, he says, Kama is the favorable engagement of the senses. So he lists that all of them there with the respective objects governed by the mind in union with the self. Moving on to a more specific definition, it says, Sparsha Vishesha Vishayatvasyaabhimanika Sukhanu Vidha Phalavat-tyartha Pratitihi Pradhanyat Kamaha. So what does that mean? Principally, kama is the consciousness of pleasure resulting from the specific contact of senses of touch, permeated by mental delight and bearing fruit in the form of bliss. So what else is kama or desire? We see here that kamas tadagre samavartatadhi manaso retaf prathamam yadasit. This is from the Rig Veda. What does it say? That in the beginning desire arose, which was the first seed of mind. What does that mean? It means that in that creation that was taking place, that something in it wanted to have creation, and that's why creation began. And this is what it is referring to. So the definition is that it is the drive for sensory pleasure, emotional affection and aesthetic enjoyment. In the context of the next verse, we see that while Bhishma was on his bed of arrows, he was having a dialogue with Yudhishthira. During that time, we see that sage Vyasa and his son Shuka were having a discussion, and Vyasa was teaching his son about the path to renunciation or nivritti versus the path to action or pravritti. So what does he say? He says, Kama bandhanam evaikam nanyadastiha bandhanam kama bandhana mukto hi brahma bhuyaya kalpate. So what does that mean? There is only one bond in the world, and that is the bond of desire. There is no other. One who is free from the bond of desire becomes fit for attaining the Brahman or the infinite reality. Another idea from the Gita is about the fact that Kama is legitimate when it is not contrary to dharma. So, balam balavatam chaham kama raga vivarjitam dharma viruddho bhuteshu kamosmi bharatarshava. So, what does he say? I am the strength of the strong, devoid of desire and liking. I am in beings the desire, which is not contrary to dharma, O Lord of the Bharatas. Moving on here, we see that there is this idea of the evolution of our karma experience from being very mundane and very gross to from sensory gratification, more of the hedonistic pleasure, to the highest levels of sublimated bliss, which is ananda or divine delight. So that entire range is what karma consists of. And finally, moksha, the ultimate freedom. So we see that moksha is regarded as the final goal. So it says even if there are, in the Purusharthas, we have 4 goals that are mentioned, but finally it is the moksha alone which is supposed to be what is the most desirable. So it says, Yo vai bhuma tat sukham nalpe sukham asti. So this is in the Chandogya Upanishad when Narada comes and tells Sanat Kumara, the young sage, that, I know everything and all, I've got everything, but I'm still worried. So what's the secret of liberation and happiness? So this is what he says, Yo vai bhuma, that which is expansive, the infinite alone is happiness. There's no happiness in the finite. And therefore, we see that what is moksha? Moksha is the liberation from the cycle of rebirth or samsara and the conditioning of the ego. Moreover, moksha is also the liberation from avidya, ignorance and the cycle of suffering. In terms of the psychological state, it is a shift from egocentricity to universal consciousness. It's the 4th goal. It is the defining contribution that distinguishes Indian psychology from secular models that we've seen so far. Trying to summarize it all, we see that when we talked of Indian psychology proposing a value-based destination for all of us, like I mentioned at the outset, that it is very prescriptive. Human life has a definite destination. That destination is about trying to find liberation, and we have to use life's various experiences through artha and kama on the basis of dharma in order to eventually arrive there. So it's a very, very clear destination that is marked for each one of us within the context of Indian psychology. In the context of systemic interaction, Vyasa laments to King Janamejaya after composing this massive text of the Mahabharata and showing that adharma leads to destruction and dharma leads to victory. He says, yet human beings continue to chase money and pleasure, ignoring the whole idea of dharma. So he says, Urdhva bahur viramyesha nacha kinchit shrinoti mam dharmadarthascha kamascha sakimartham na sevyate. So basically he says, I cry with my arms raised, from dharma comes wealth and desire, why is it not followed? And then this presents a systemic view where Vyasa argues that if you want artha and kama to last, they must be built on the foundations of dharma. What's the interdependence? So artha without dharma is exploitation and kama without dharma is lust. In terms of the 3 vargas, we see that there is a focus on worldly life, pravritti, while moksha is about nivritti or renunciation. In terms of the integration, moksha provides the detachment needed to engage in the worldly life in a safe manner. When we talk of conflict resolution, dharma is the ultimate arbiter in the psychological conflicts. So when do you make a decision which is for your greater good? Look at what is the dharmic perspective on it. In terms of the holistic approach, neglecting any one goal leads to the split personality or neurosis. In terms of the final goal, in this case we talk of not only freedom from something, but also freedom in. And this is a very important idea here, that when we talk of moksha, it is not necessarily saying you have to leave everything and go away. That is the easiest way of doing things. At a certain stage, it is important to let go things and then find one's liberation in those things. But finally, what is called for is that you're in the midst of life and yet you're detached and you can engage in the most effective manner with the worldly experiences. So this is the higher experience of moksha, which is expected, and all of us are invited to try and achieve that in our lives. Comparative concept with the theories of motivation. So intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Karma and artha are extrinsic motivations and they seek rewards or they avoid punishment. So wealth, sex, status. In terms of transition, dharma is a transition when you're going from a dharma to swadharma. It is identified and established as a regulator for greater good, where you're doing duty for social and individual well-being. In terms of the intrinsic motivation, we've got moksha, where action is performed for the inherent satisfaction of the self or Atman. The goal, there is a shifting from external locus of control to internal locus of control. And what's the primary difference with Western psychology? Western psychology often views these as states, but Indian psychology views them as an evolutionary journey. Sri Aurobindo's integral view, he talks of the evolution of Purusharthas, where physical man is driven by survival instincts, artha and kama, ethical man is driven by mental control and dharma, spiritual man is driven by supramental freedom or moksha, and transformation, the goal is not to escape, but manifestation of the divine in life. In terms of evolution, the four goals are the soul's stages of unfolding towards the divine. So it's never about rejection or suppression, but about an engagement, but from a conscious perspective. What are the Chaturashrama framework? So the Chaturashrama, it comes from the root shram, which means labor, to exercise one's efforts, and ashrama means from the beginning to the end there is an effort. So it implies the stage of effort or the ladder of ascent. So Chatuhu means four, the four stages of life which are a continuous process of an effort that we have to make. When we talk of the synergy, we see that the Purusharthas is the what or the goals, while ashrama is the when or the timeline in which these different goals become relevant. And the goal itself is to ensure that every stage of life contributes to the dharana, the social and ecological sustainability, rather than perpetual consumption. Trying to go to the Vedic roots, we see that the Jabala Upanishad provides one of the first formal codification of the four stages as a path to liberation. What's the first one? Is Brahmacharya, which is the foundation. It's the first one that is also associated with the Purushartha of Dharma. So two things here. There is a lifespan development which is happening. The first 25 years are what is considered to be given to the experience of Brahmacharya. That's the stage of Brahmacharya. So life is divided into four. Each of the four is associated with a certain name in terms of the stage of life, as well as associated with a certain Purushartha there. So we see that here at the Brahmacharya phase, where you're a student phase, it's about learning Dharma. The focus is on Vidya, education, and the cultivation of self-restraint. What are its core principles? Sanyama or self-control. What are the societal values? Before a citizen is allowed to consume artha and kama, they must first become master of the science of duty or dharma. How do you understand the laws of everything that functions, so that when you have to apply them in the later stage or the middle stage of life or the your work professional stage of life, you're well equipped with the knowledge that is required to do the best. Brahmacharyam ashrayet purvam dharme matin avasthitaha. What does that mean? First, one should take to studenthood with the mind firmly fixed on dharma. This is another very important idea that is there during the Brahmacharya phase, and basically talks of these Pancha Mahayajnas, the 5 yajnas that we have to perform, and the 5 rinas or the 5 debts that we have. What are these? So it talks of the fact that our life, to where we are today, has come as a result of many other people's contributions. We have to give back to them. So here it is Brahma Yajna, sacrifice to the seers of knowledge. The rina is the Rishi rina. The next is the Pitri Yajna, which is a sacrifice to the ancestors, and this is connected to Pitra Rina. So our ancestors have done things, that's why we are where we are. Next, Daiva Yajna. It's a sacrifice to the gods. And this is connected to the Deva Rina principle. You have the Nr Yajna or the Manushya Yajna, which is the sacrifice to humans, Manushya Rina or Nr Rina. So these are interrelated concepts. And the last one here is the Bhuta Yajna or the sacrifice to the living beings. This is associated with Bhuta Rina, which is about offering of food and all to animals. So we see that all these creatures and all the different beings are associated with who we are today, and we have to give back to them in different ways. Next phase of life is the Grihastha. That's where which is the engine of society. So here we see that the shloka from the Manusmriti says, Yatha vayum samashritya vartante sarvajantavaha tatha grihastham ashritya vartante sarva ashramaha. So just as all living beings depend on air to stay alive, so do all other stages of life depend on the householder. In terms of sustainability, the householder is the economic driver who sustains the students, the retirees and the monks. It's a very, very important phase of life. And in today's world, if we look at it, the Grihastha ashrama is not as stable and steady as it used to be. And if that is not so stable and steady, then what will happen to the rest of society? So this calls for deeper introspection and thought as well. Vanaprastha, that's the next. That's in the third phase of life. So the first phase Brahmacharya, second phase, first phase 25 years, next phase 25 years of Grihastha, which is associated with Kama and with Artha, because that's when you're earning, that's when you are enjoying your sexual experiences and fulfilling of desires through the family, through various other means. And then we move on to the third phase. So this is 50s, when you are now, the senses are changing, the capacities are changing, the next generation has grown up. What does one do then? So it recommends the stage of Vanaprastha, the transition, which is about withdrawal and mentorship. The focus is on transitioning from extrinsic wealth to intrinsic wisdom. And what does it say? It's about handing over the reins of Artha to the next generation. So it says, Grihasthastu yada pashyet valipalitam atmanaha apatyasyeva chapatyam tadaranyam samashrayet. So what is he saying? When a householder sees his skin wrinkled, his hair turning grey, and sons of his sons, grandchildren, then he should take refuge in the forest. So what's the psychological shift? It is moving from a life of taking to a life of giving back through disinterested guidance. What's the societal value? It prevents the elder stagnation phenomenon, where the older generation clings to resources and powers for allowing a healthy social turnover. This we see in the society today, where it's not so easy to let go, and the older generation wants to keep playing the same role of, the leadership role within the family. But things have changed a lot. So it is wisdom in knowing when to step back and allowing the next generation to take the reins, as they said. So what's the last phase, which is sannyasa or ultimate freedom? So here it is talked about moksha being the final goal that the sannyasa has to strive for. It says, Yona hrishyati na dveshti na shochati na kangshati. This is what the Bhagavad Gita says. Who neither rejoices, nor hates, nor agrees, nor desires anything from the finite. And this is the final state where the realization of the bhuma, the infinite, where the individual is no longer a consumer of the earth's resources, but a source of peace for the prajaha or all beings. Looking at an integration of Purushartha and Ashrama, so we've got the Brahmacharya, who should focus on dharma, acquisition of dharma, and learning the laws of balance and restraint. The Grihastha, the second phase of life, is connected to Artha and Kama, but mind you, on the basis of Dharma. Here, this generation of wealth ethically to support society. The third phase is Vanaprastha, or the Swadharma becomes important. One starts turning inwards and saying, what was my purpose in running for these last 50 years so much? What is it that we are going to gain ultimately? Because when the time comes, then we're not going to carry back anything of that we've run after for so long. So what then becomes relevant? So Swadharma is about finding that purpose and meaning for one's own existence. And then moksha also. The role is sustainable, and sustainability is the voluntary reduction of consumption and mentorship positions. In terms of sannyasa, moksha becomes the primary goal, realization of self-sufficient, infinite joy. All of this also comes in the context of punarjanma or rebirth, because the idea is if we are running, we are, what is it all for? And if we have to find moksha and we've not found moksha in this lifetime, then what happens? Do we get hung somewhere in space and we have now nowhere to go? In our context, there is the reassurance that we are all coming back. There is a punarjanma, but we have to keep trying. And the actions that we perform will also play a role in determining what are the different experiences that we will enter into the next lifetime. So it says the logic of continuity, punarjanma or reincarnation, removes the scarcity mentality of a single life trajectory. If life is a one-time event, the rush for artha and kama becomes frantic and unsustainable. Naturally, if you've got only one lifetime to enjoy everything, it builds a very different mindset. Then you know that many lifetimes are there and the ultimate goal is to go beyond this thirst for wealth and sexuality, etc. It's a psychological buffer. Understanding that the soul or the jiva has multiple opportunities to evolve allows the individual to embrace the restraints of brahmacharya and the renunciation of sannyasa without a sense of loss. Next, sustainability link. So there is a belief in punarjanma that fosters a long-term investment in the planet. We do not just inherit the planet from our ancestors, but we rent it from our future selves. And very typically, this idea also led to the practice of making decisions based on the seventh generation. So your decision should not harm the seventh generation. Only then would that decision be worth taking. Kind of a call for wisdom, which is very, very important. Death becomes an opportunity for a renewal. So we have this from the Bhagavad Gita, which says, Vasansi jirnani yatha vihaya navani grihnati naroparani tatha sharirani vihaya jirnan nyanyani sanyati navani dehi. So what is it saying? This is in the second chapter when Arjuna is totally dejected, that I'm going to kill so many people. Shri Krishna assures him that ultimately these bodies have to go. Just like we are wearing dress and a dress tears, you have to wear a new one. Similarly, the soul lives through a particular, dress. And then when that dress is no longer capable of sustaining it, it will have to let it go and wear a new one. So a person puts on a new garment or new garments, giving up old ones. The embodied self similarly accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones. And what's Sri Aurobindo's view on the Chaturashrama? He says that the ashramas are not rigid social rules, but an evolutionary psychology designed to lead the human being from the infra-rational to the supramental. What's the purpose of the stages? Brahmacharya is not just about study, but the gathering of the prana shakti, vital energy and mental clarity. During Grihastha, there is a necessary external field where the soul tests its strength and exhausts its desires through ethical action. In Vanaprastha and Sannyasa, the spiritualization of the individual takes place where one prepares to become a channel for the divine will. A quote of Sri Aurobindo, he says, the Chaturashrama was a great and noble discipline. It gave a place to every side of human nature, but it kept the spiritual goal always in the front. What's the synthesis? Sri Aurobindo argued that the ashrama system prevents society from becoming barbaric, purely materialistic, by ensuring that the final stage of every human life is dedicated to the pursuit of the spirit within oneself. Contemporary relevance, the blueprint for civilizational homeostasis. So this is the solution to perpetual consumerism. So in modernity, we are doing this flat life model where one remains a grihastha, a consumer, from the age of 18 to the age of 80. And this creates infinite demand and sources within a finite planet, which is completely not sustainable. The dharmic correction is that the ashrama system introduces the phase out in a very graceful, dignified manner. By transitioning to vanaprastha, the individual voluntarily reduces their consumption footprints, shifting from resource taker to wisdom giver. What is the root and fruit? Dynamic regulatory control. So when dharma or ethics and moksha are positioned at the roots of the human system, artha and kama are kept in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Dharma as a regulator, it ensures that artha is not predatory. It transforms profit at all costs into sustainability. Moksha as a desired ceiling. So the realization of the bhuma makes the pursuit of kama refined and qualitative rather than quantitative driven and addictive. The result, without these roots, artha and kama become malignant, growing without purpose. With these roots, they become nourishing, growing to serve the whole. What's the mental and midlife crisis here? So psychologically, many suffer because they apply grihastha metric salary status looks to vanaprastha also. But here we can have the right measure for knowing what is important at which stage of life. The evolutionary exit, so integrating Sri Aurobindo's worldview, we see that transition to later stages is not retirement, but an evolution of consciousness. It moves the individual from extrinsic validation to intrinsic realization. Another way of connecting all of these, and an exercise for you. So evaluate a contemporary entity like a tech giant, etc. And by using the Purushartha and the Chaturashrama framework. Now, does it fulfill the dharana, or are these sustainable ecosystems, or are they extractive? Does it foster brahmacharya culture of learning and discipline? Is wealth generated through utthanam, industriousness, or exploitation? Does the householder entity support the broader community in today's context? Does it offer genuine fulfillment of sukha, or rely on kama bandhana, addictive consumption, debt? So we see this entire credit card basis of consumption is a very short-sighted pursuit of enjoyment at the cost of, non-existent of real funds at times. Now, does it lead to bhuma, mental freedom and growth, or create a cycle of burnout? Does it allow for a vanaprastha transition into mentorship? And propose one change to move this entity from infinite growth to finite planet towards the civilizational homeostasis. Okay. Some glossary for you. References. And food for thought at the end. So Sri Aurobindo says, be conscious first of thyself within, then think and act. All living thought is a world in preparation. All real act is a thought manifested. So there was a lot to take in this session, but there was a lot of Sanskrit as well. I would really suggest that you keep the Sanskrit as a framework to fall back upon if you want to get into the details. The important engagement that you need to do with these sessions, especially where there's a lot of Sanskrit, is to try and capture the essential features. If you can do that, you're getting the essence or the feel of Indian psychology. And when you study Sanskrit and when you want to go deeper into the text and discover many more dimensions, then you can come back to these lessons and see what more you can benefit from them in order to pursue your higher and deeper studies into Indian psychology. Until then, namaste and see you again soon.